Welcome, everyone. Hello. I am Elisa Voschel. I'm the Executive Director here at Minnesota Center for Book Arts. And thank you all for being here today for our panel discussion with our 2023 McKnight artists, Brien Biedler and Todd Thyberg, and our wonderful visiting curators, both of whom are here from Los Angeles, Emily Zaiden and Marcia Reed. I want to thank you all for coming here today to hear this conversation and to hear about the fellows' practices and the work they've been developing over their fellowship year. For those of you who have been involved with MCBA for some time, welcome back. And if anyone happens to be new, tell you a little bit about what we do here. We are a community-based nonprofit organization dedicated to igniting creativity and community through the book arts. Through our studios, our artist development programs, educational workshops, and opportunities for people of all ages, we preserve the tools and traditions of the book arts and connect contemporary audiences to the arts of the book. We believe in the limitless creative potential of this dynamic art form and envision a world in which creative expression through the book arts is available to all. From workshops to artist talks and exhibitions, membership and supporting artists in our consignment program in our shop, there are many ways for you to connect to your own creativity and to find community here at MCBA. I'd like to acknowledge that today's program and this transformational fellowship are made possible through the generous support of the McKnight Foundation. We are so grateful to be part of this cohort of other organizations and to be able to provide this deep and impactful fellowship for mid-career book artists. Founded on the belief that working artists activate our communities and deepen the dimension and quality of our lives, support for individual artists has been a focus of the McKnight Foundation's Arts and Culture program since its inception. McKnight Artist and Culture Bearer Fellowships increase the exploratory opportunity, economic stability, and productive capacity of artists by providing a $25,000 unrestricted stipend for supporting mid-career artists and discipline-specific artistic and professional development opportunities. MCBA is one of 15 program partners administering these fellowships and structuring them to respond to the unique needs of artists working across various disciplines. Like the McKnight Foundation, we believe that support for working artists is crucial, and that artists and culture bearers illuminate experiences, inspire joy, express the cultural diversity of our communities, and advance justice, enriching the vitality and vibrancy of our state. We are honored to be a partner with them in this work. Support for our programs is also provided by through the voters of Minnesota through a Minnesota State Arts Board operating support grant, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, as well as individual supporters and members of MCBA. If you enjoy today's program, please consider becoming a member, making a donation to support our work so that we can continue to provide enriching arts programming for artists and enthusiasts of all ages and backgrounds. And now it is my immense pleasure to introduce Annika Schneider, our Director of Exhibitions and Artist Programs, who oversees MCBA's McKnight Fellowship Program, and will introduce our speakers. Please join me in welcoming Annika.
Thank you, Elisa. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on this really perfect Saturday in June. Again, my name is Annika Schneider, and I use she, her pronouns. For today's programming, we are so fortunate to learn more about our 2023 Fellows work, Brien Biedler and Todd Thyberg. First, we will hear from Brien and Emily Zaiden, the director and curator of the Craft in America Center in Los Angeles. Then we will hear from Todd and Marcia Reed, who recently retired from the Getty Research Institute, where she was chief curator and associate director for special collections and exhibitions. And just to give you all a little bit of context, Brien and Todd started their fellowships last August and have been in conversation with Marcia and Emily since last fall about their work and practice. And yesterday, the whole group was able to do studio visits in person with both Brien and Todd. So following slides and conversation from both pairs, all four will have a brief conversation on the studio visits from this week, and then we will have moderated questions from the audience. So first I would like to introduce Brien and Emily a bit more. Brien is the proprietor of Biedler Made, a bookbinding and toolmaking practice located in the northeast neighborhood of Minneapolis. He operates within a small niche, making bespoke leather books for book lovers and specialized tools for bookmakers and other craftspeople. His bookwork celebrates the structure and aesthetics of pre-industrial bindings in a 21st century context. And his toolmaking focuses on the creation of hand-engraved decorative leather stamps called finishing tools. Though much of his practice is dedicated to executing commissions from private individuals and fellow binders, Brien has work that can be found at the San Francisco Public Library, the Oak Spring Garden Foundation, the Library of Congress, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Brien is often invited to share his binding and toolmaking through workshops at various art and craft institutions, and he has taught both nationally and internationally. Emily Zaiden is director and curator of the Craft in America Center, where she has organized nearly 80 contemporary art, craft, and design exhibitions for the center and partner museum venues since 2010. Zaiden oversees public programs, a K-12 education initiative, and digital projects, including the development of an online craft video dictionary that was recently launched. She writes and publishes exhibition catalogs, essays, and articles for journals and books such as Archives of American Art Journal, American Tapestry Alliance, Metalsmith, architect and designer, and Consuelo Jimenez Underwood Art, Weaving Vision and Vision. Zaiden focuses on craft processes, materiality, functional design, and cultural art from a historical lens throughout her work, where she received an MA from the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture. She was a research associate for the Decorative Arts and Design Department at LACMA and research editor for Architectural Digest prior to joining Craft in America. So I'll now welcome Brien to the podium to show some slides of his work.
Is it possible to do the little clippy one, or should I hold this thought? Oh, okay. I also have to quickly swap out my computer. Yay. Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you both, Annika and Elisa, for the introduction, and to MCBA for hosting this event, and of course to the McKnight Foundation. My name is Brien Biedler, and I'm a bookbinder and a toolmaker. So I make books and I'm going to share a little bit about my practice as it currently is for these slides. And then Emily and I will sort of talk about where I'm hoping to go with it. Many of my books are very historically inspired. I don't really do direct copies of historic books, but as you can see, the aesthetics and structures are all kind of celebrate those processes. I also make tools. These are tools just for general or specialized tools for bookbinding and box making, but I specialize in making finishing tools, which, as Annika mentioned, are the decorative leather stamps used to compose designs on book covers. And briefly, because it'll probably come up, I just wanted to cover sort of the anatomy of a finishing tool in case I mention any of these parts. But essentially you have the face of the tool, which is where the design is. Then the head or table of the tool is just what supports that design underneath. And then normally a thinner kind of tapered section called the shank or the shaft, and the tang is what sits inside the handle. As mentioned, to give you a little bit of context, I started my journey in the bookbinding world actually studying conservation. However, it only took a few short years to realize that I was much more interested in making new books than just working with old ones. So I decided to move, kind of change directions and go into a more contemporary bookbinding practice. However, the history of the book is so rich and full. The structure of these books are just really beautiful, and so that's always stuck with me. And I always wanted to continue to make new books, but using these time-old techniques. And so even today, this is more or less the kind of process that I follow, a general outline. For those of you unfamiliar with this document, it's a 17th century broadside that bookbinders published to advocate for higher wages. The nice thing is that they said, what they did was they were like, we're going to list every step of the binding process to show people how hard it is to make a book. And then hopefully we can get, some higher wages as a result of that. I don't think that it worked, but maybe that's because they needed to add one more step to the process, which is making finishing tools. But still, this as a document, it's really, really important because it's one of the few things that actually outlines every step along the way and more or less in order. And so if you follow those instructions or that outline, you end up with a book that sort of looks like this. This, of course, is a very extra binding, is what they would have called it, a really luxurious, fancy one with lots of gold tooling. Not all books, of course, were this ornate. And I do have this book up on the table, so I encourage you to take a look at that afterwards. But one of the things that I love about it is that the tooling, while it's really ornate and really complicated, was just executed by hand and eye really, really quickly. And so it kind of results in something that is still somewhat approachable, and I think that's because the evidence of the hands that made it haven't been erased. It's something that allows you to still see something and say, wow, that's beautiful, but you also want to touch it and interact with it. And of course, all of the really beautiful parts of the process get covered up by leather and gold, so I wanted to just share a couple pictures. I know many of you are familiar with different parts of this process, so I won't get too far into this process, but sewing some end bands down below. And then, of course, gold tooling. So again, I used 23 karat gold leaf and the traditional egg glare method of gold tooling, so it's a very kind of fickle process and depends a lot on temperature and humidity, but it's really fun when the gold sticks and everything works out, which conveniently it does in this video. So I also have a few stills of this process as well. Again, it's just this very elusive process. It was really hard to figure out how it worked, and I'm more or less self-taught in this area. Although since then I've had the chance to take a couple of workshops with people who've been doing it for years. And when you're tooling, it's really challenging because you can't actually see super well what you've tooled and what you haven't tooled. I mean, you're looking at the solid gold sheet, so you're always kind of angling lights to see where you've made impressions and where you still need to make impressions. And then again, you hope everything sticks and hope that you didn't forget a couple areas. Which fortunately you can go back and add more. And so here's that finished book. But in order to do these kinds of books, you need the tools, and a lot of different tools. I mean, that red book I showed a few slides ago has, I think I counted about 3 dozen or so individual tools. They're all really expensive to get these days, or hard to find if you want to find cheap ones. However, I started to discover a few different binders who had made tools for different projects. These books are, the book you're seeing here is part of the Historic Model Collection in Iowa. And I was really, I've always loved Shauna's work in general, but seeing the fact that she made the tools sort of inspired me to give it a go. I thought, wow, this is possible. It's not off limits. So even though I didn't have any metalworking experience, I was able to just kind of jump in and get some files and some brass and see what happened. So on the left, you can see some of my earlier tools, and I used the diamond that's circled in red to tool the book on the right. And then that book ended up getting into a traveling exhibition for the Guild of Bookworkers a few years ago. And so for me, that was a really empowering experience, and I felt like I was on the right track or on the right path. And so from there, I needed to learn more about metalworking though. So I took an engraving class, just an intro engraving class down at a place in Kansas. And then came back with those skills and started studying older books, looking at the stamps and seeing how they were creating these designs. And the nice thing is unlike a book where the leather's covering everything underneath it, with the tools, since it's just a simple stamped impression, I mean, you can actually see exactly how they were cutting those lines. And so if you try to just if you can figure out how to go from thin to thick with the graver, you can start making these tools. And then eventually other binders started to commission me to make tools for projects they had going on. So this was a tool that I had to cut for a conservation project that the Ohio-based binder Gabrielle Fox was working on. But however, I didn't just want to copy historic tools, just like with the books. I didn't just want to make models of historic books. And so this book, which also is on the table along with this tool, was a really big breakthrough for me. I was looking at the little, I've heard it called the Will of the Wisp tool that's in the center of those panels. And it's kind of like a little ghost going across the spine. But the way the leather had cracked, it looked like a little campfire or flickering flame. So I made this tool kind of based on that, so that it works within the sort of historic aesthetic, but it also is a brand new tool. And then that really, once that kind of breakthrough happened, it really started to get kind of wild. And I started to just cut different tools. Some of these are for commissions for people. Some of them are just things that popped in my head, like a unicorn hedgehog. Or a successful morel foray. So, and then if you're curious about the process, I have a few bits of the process up on the table, but just a very brief run through. I make all my tools from solid brass right now. And you can see kind of going from the top left that I cut out the rough shape and then polish the face of the tool. And then you have kind of the blank starting place. And then with files, drill bits, jeweler saws sometimes before I could engrave. And of course, engraving, you can create just an infinite array of designs. So here's just a little video showing engraving. It's, as you can imagine, pretty challenging to photograph or document because it's on such a tiny scale. I work under a microscope now it ranges from 5 to 30 magnification. And so it's a whole setup. But it's very satisfying when everything's working out. So with just that ability to go from thick to thin with lines, if you get a good grasp on what your composition is going to be, the sky's the limit. And then of course, making the handles now, I used to split the logs and hand plane all these tapered handles, and it was definitely working a lot harder than smarter. And so someone was like, why don't you get a lathe? And I was like, what's a lathe? That was a big game changer. But again, there's a million different ways to make these tools. Most modern tool makers over in Europe are now making them by soldering the piece. So they'll use like a CNC machine or some other kind of mechanical means of cutting the design, and then they'll solder that to the brass shank and set that in the handle. I have always, just like with the books, I fell in love with historic tools just as objects. And so I really wanted to make cast tools, but I didn't have any casting equipment. So the solid carved version that I just showed you is sort of what I've settled upon for the moment. However, I've been moving towards casting and doing a lot of experiments. And so you can see here, kind of going from the top left down, is the casting cleaned up and then the final engraved tools. And that's really nice because I always forget about that part. I'm like, why are you laughing? But yeah, so I'm really excited too because I'll be able to make bronze tools instead of brass tools, and really kind of dial in the alloy to make it the best that I can possibly make. So what I want to share with you now is one book that kind of combines these two facets of my practice. And this also was a big breakthrough piece for me as well. And so it sort of paved the road for what I hope to do during the remainder of the fellowship and probably my career. So this book was commissioned by a client, and they're Chinese American, and so they wanted a binding that kind of celebrated their heritage. And so what we did was we worked really closely together on coming up with a design, and I sent a bunch of pictures of historic bindings, different tooling layouts, and the book on the left is what they decided was the one that resonated the most with them. And then I went to the Minneapolis Institute of Art, took a ton of pictures of different artworks there, and then these were the three pieces that really resonated with the client. And so there's sort of this, can you see the curve? Yeah. The little meandering S here, these peonies, and then the leaves as well. And then this is an ivory hammock stay for keeping, the individual cords of your hammock separate. And it was all hand carved. I mean, we can drive up the street and see it. It's beautiful. And so these were the tools that I cut with those inspirations. And so you can see here, they're not direct copies or anything, but they are directly influenced by these originals. And it's been a really interesting path because you sort of have to filter out or filter through the different, you have to filter things into book language and book aesthetic. And so if you were to just merely copy this design and put it on a book, it wouldn't look quite right. So I really enjoyed that challenge. And here are a few process shots. And again, the finished book next to the original inspiration, so you can kind of see the nod. And so this was a really powerful project for me because, not only was it just really powerful that someone entrusted me with that kind of project, but it was also really important because it showed me that just because I'm working in this sort of historic language, it doesn't have to remain in the past, that it's something that I can use to tell stories from today. And so I'm really interested in doing projects that kind of make comments on the role books have played in history and culture in general, kind of using this sort of visual vocabulary that I've been working with for the last few years. So I'd also like to thank Sean Aleno and Jim Croft, who both were huge inspirations for me in terms of tool making and bookbinding and putting these things together. They also really inspired me just with their general who they are as people and their attitudes towards life and their generosity. And even though I don't have pictures of them, I would love to thank Mary Hark and Corinne Hark-Weber and Amar Hark-Weber, who are all three here, for encouraging me to apply in the first place for the McKnight. It really has been a life-changing experience, and I owe you guys everything for that. And then, of course, my family, my partner Katie, and our little kid Morris, and our doggy Brien. And all of you for being here. So thank you so much. Okay. Yes, I should move this.
Okay, so thanks so much, Brien, for that introduction. It has been incredible to learn about the breadth of your practice over these months, and I think you touched on that, and I think we should start there because your knowledge of so many different materials, essentially, let alone processes, is pretty exceptional. Is that okay, sound-wise? Should I move this closer?
Reverb.
Yeah. So you are self-taught, but can you tell everybody a little bit more about how you went about that? It's not just like you picked up a book and it was all there.
Right. I would say, in the end, really nobody's course, self-taught in the sense that we're all coming from some kind of lineage, even if it's just historic precedents. But should I just start with kind of how I got into books in general?
Sure.
Okay. So, also, I'm sorry, this sound is killing me. I don't know if, could it be the two mics?
I think we're gonna have to separate them.
Is that still happening? Don't hear it? Okay, I can just hold it. Okay. I'll flip it so we can both get in there. Okay, cool. So, well, I started out in high school. I was just in a high school art class, and the instructor said that we were supposed to take an old library book that was going to the dumpster and cut it up and make it into a sculpture. And for some reason in that exact moment, I thought, I want to do the exact opposite of that. I want to have the paper and I want to fold it up and sew it up and make a book. And I had no idea anything about the process. I just kind of liked books. And so a few years later, when I was in undergrad, I was reading an old book and the back cover tore off, and I just took it to the university library and just said, surely there's somebody here who knows something about how books are put together. And I thought they had maybe some kind of magic tape or something that would fix it and make all the problems go away. Which of course I learned later on is what you do not want to do. But they said, oh, you need to go up to special collections. And Marie Ferrara, the head of special collections, she's done a lot of book binding. Maybe she'll know. And so I went upstairs, they introduced me to Marie, and it was a smaller college. So I was very fortunate in that you had access to the head of special collections with no appointment or anything. And she started saying, oh yeah, here's what you got to do and this and that. And I thought, oh my God, she knows how to do bookbinding. And so I kind of dropped on my hands and knees and was just like, please teach me. And so that was how I got my start. I started volunteering in the special collections, and they had a kind of like a small little conservation studio where they would do repairs for stabilizing things for exhibits and such. And so they sort of took me under their wing. And then right out of undergrad, I got a job at a library in Charleston. It's a very small city, big town sort of thing. So it's they asked me to start running a conservation lab, and I thought, I do not have this experience. I knew just enough of what I knew to know how much I didn't know. And so I just said, I feel very uncomfortable with this idea. But they encouraged me to still, try it out. And it was to keep it low stakes. And they also said that they would help pay for my education. So it was kind of like where I would see specific holes that needed filled. I would try to find someone who knew those things and then pursue that route. And so I will say that whole experience was kind of helped me always be very resourceful when there was something I needed to know and something I needed to figure out. So even though it was kind of frustrating because I never felt like I was maybe doing the right thing, or I always had questions about that because I didn't have a straight traditional institutional background in that realm, it really helped me to always ask questions and kind of never say something's not possible.
Great. So let's see back then, as far as your early interest in the book, what about the aesthetics of European books? That's spoken to you. Why?
They're just objects of power. I mean, there's just something about them that I grew up, reading a lot, of course, and I think probably many people in this room can relate to just, I don't know, something about books. But I always loved medieval stuff. I was always reading kind of medieval fantasy books and things like that. And I think in those books are always this sort of revered, powerful object, and they sort of have answers to things. And so I think that always just kind of appealed to me. And then when my grandparents had a few older books, and I just thought they were like the most sacred relics ever. And I would just go and hide in a corner and just look at them. And I wouldn't even try to open them or anything. I just looked at the binding. But I don't know. I don't know how to explain why. It just was. It always was.
You clearly have very strong interest in historic processes and traditions, and you talk about books as being timeless. So what does that mean to you, timeless? How so?
I think part of it is that it's seeing well-made, well-constructed books that are 1,000 or 2,000 years old. I think there's that aspect of timelessness, but there's also just something about a certain, at least in maybe I'm sure it's somewhat contextual to us now, but with sort of the advent of all this digital media and things stop, print stops being the main way that we look for information. And so there's got to be some nostalgic aspect of like, this was a time when the information was in this beautiful physical format that you could access. And I'm sure that that's playing some role in there. But I mean, if you picture just like a lawyer being interviewed on TV, he's just got like they got a stack of good guilt books behind them because it gives authority to what they're saying. And so I think for some reason there's something in our culture that we just look to them as some source of authority. Even though I suspect you're leading us there, but I think that there's also some problems with that too.
Yes, and we'll get there definitely. Well, even think about your example, the books with clamps and kind of keeping that information sacred and how you weave that into your aesthetic is really interesting. But so backing up to how you learned your knowledge of this craft. So we're getting there as far as self-taught, but you've also been incredible about research and reinventing lost processes. Can you talk about some of your experiences in acquiring that?
Yeah, I think when I was working for that library, it was really nice because sometimes I would be looking to figure out how to best work on this, treat this one book I was working on. But you could go into the stacks of the vault and just start looking at books that were similar, but maybe in different states of disrepair. And so then you could start to study, oh, it's actually this is going into this hole and that's causing that issue to happen. And so it kind of gives you the tools to, learning from the books themselves.
As objects.
Yeah, as objects was, I think, really important, as well as I was sort of, at this time was when the Legacy Press and they continue to just publish, knock out scholarship on the history of the book. So it also gave you, if not an exact answer to your question, you could contact the person who wrote that article, and chances are they would know the right way to go to get what you needed.
And your whole other additional practice of tool making. How about learning all of those skills as well?
Yeah, that I honestly was just a lot of that was just trial and error. And again, if I have some of my early tools up here and you can see they're way cruder, and it was just kind of a means to an end. But then as I got more comfortable and started learning more about the different tools that I needed and tools that I knew what they were called, so I knew how to find them. It just kind of kept snowballing and getting easier and easier. And then I started meeting a few metal people. And so having a few metalheads in my life allowed me to kind of contact them and say, hey, I'm trying to do this thing. Is there something? Like, oh yeah, you need a Riffler file. And I'm like, what's that? So it's like, I'm really just grateful for the community. It was also at a time when kind of the social media kind of connected a lot of people in different parts of the world and different corners of the book world. And so you were able to find someone who was doing what you were, at least some part of what you were trying to do. And so you could kind of, send them a message and just say, hey, I know you don't know me at all, but I love your work. And is there any way, you could share this bit of it? And sometimes they'd say no or ignore the request, but you just kind of, I needed to know, so I wasn't going to stop until I found out.
You definitely have that spirit. Yes. Well, yeah, I think for even curatorially, people don't even art historians don't realize how often artists need to make their own tools. I think you've gone a couple extra miles with what you're doing, but you know, it's just not discussed how you can do the work without the tools, and often the tools don't exist. So
And one thing I will add to that is Jim and Shauna, who I depicted being tool makers and having lots of experience with making clasps and things like that. I mean, they really paved the road in terms of even just the fact of seeing someone doing it made it known that it was possible. I don't know that if I was in their shoes, I would have had the same sort of empowerment, and maybe I wouldn't have kept pushing through. But it was like seeing that they had done it and made such beautiful stuff with such simple tools. And then again, their generosity. So they did give me a very strong a foundation and inspiration to kind of know that it was a possibility.
okay, and so these skills, the processes between, yes, the tool making, because tools don't exist anywhere essentially, as well as all your book processes. That gap, what can you talk a little bit about that and what you've learned from European makers versus the lack of makers here in the US? Because it was shocking to know that nobody has these skills anymore in the US, or very few.
Yeah, it was sort of a matter of, you know, the engraving class that I took was kind of that surface decorative engraving where you would see, like, I don't know, decorative plates or engraved shotguns or something. The person who taught me made bamboo fly fishing rods and engraved the little metal couplers, and they're, I mean, unreal. But that type of engraving, while somewhat useful, is still not the same deep relief that you need, because, you know, again, the tool's not the final product, it's the impression that the tool makes. And so if you're not getting the right impression, you have to go back and work on the tool, even though that might look perfect. And so getting to studying old tools, seeing how deeply things were engraved was kind of a big revelation, because then I thought, okay, I need to make things as deep as I possibly can, because that'll ensure that everything's nice and crisp. But the tools used for deep engraving are slightly different than the tools used for the surface engraving. And so then I would just go on, I thought maybe people who engrave signet rings, which I know that still happens, might have some kind of clue. But the jewelry world is a little bit more protective over things like that. And I happened to find this one YouTube video of somebody engraving a ring, and for one split second they showed them engraving really deep, and I saw the shape of the graver, and I was like, that's what I need to do. So I've started kind of regrinding the tools a little bit, and when you just look up general engraving stuff, they make it seem so complicated, when really it's like just tiny chisels being pushed through metal. Is how, you know, it could be put that simply. Of course, there's a lot more to it.
To you, maybe.
But in answer to your question, it was also frustrating because a lot of the new tools are made using more industrial and automated processes. But since I was working in such a historic niche, a lot of those details on the tools, those types of machines can't capture the same details that something that's engraved can capture. Yet, I'm sure it'll probably get there at some point. But I thought, well, if I really want to nail the aesthetic that I'm going for, I have to figure out a way to do it by hand. And the only place in France that still does it by hand said no to sharing things. So I was able to the more I did engraving, the more I could kind of see the types of tool marks that my gravers were leaving on the tools. So then when I would go look at old tools, then I could see the tool marks that their tools were leaving and try to figure out more of how they were getting so clean and so deep. And that, I think, is a process I'm still in the middle of figuring out, and it's getting there.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about first of all, the commissions and how that process works, how you collaborate with your client to determine what the imagery is going to be for those projects.
That is, it's always kind of different depending on who you're working with. I mean, some people know exactly what they want and they'll send you a file and say, I want you to do this tooling. And I'm like, well, the process isn't quite that straightforward. And so there's a little bit of negotiation between what I have and what they want to pay to have made. And then sometimes people only know what they don't want, and that's always really frustrating because you keep saying, well, how about this? And they're like, eh. And then eventually I just say, okay, send me what you want. And until then, I'm just going to sit tight. But I mean, the project that I shared was kind of the best case scenario where they said, I really love your work. Here's what I'm trying to do. And I trust you to do that. And so just having that trust made me take it really seriously. And knowing that it was something just beyond making something beautiful, that it was something that carried a lot of meaning, kind of made me think, okay, I need to go about this like as tenderly as I can and figure out what'll make them the happiest. And so we would just kind of check in every once and again, and I would share my ideas and then give them a chance to kind of mull things over and then come back to me with what they wanted. So with commissions, it can be kind of challenging because there's always a lot of back and forth. And since it's not the cheapest, book, I want to respect that I want them to get what they want out of it. But sometimes people just say, I like your work, do something that's blue. And then I say, okay, great. So yeah, it's just kind of all over the place. Just depends on the person.
And how then this might be the same answer, that it's all over the place, but how are they using the books? How are they displaying them? Are they using them?
That's a great question. That also depends. Sometimes people are sending me an older book that they have, like a favorite novel or something, and they want just a nice binding on it. But this one, for example, was just a blank book that she wanted to use to record bits of her family history and kind of have it be sort of an heirloom kind of object, family history volume. So, I mean, mostly people are trying to do stuff that they're going to write and sketch in and use. Mm-hmm. The one really large book with the Old English G's on it was commissioned by a tattoo artist in Miami, and he wanted to use it to sketch out designs and stuff like that. And that was the biggest book I'd done to date. It was this huge book, and it was about that thick, and it was so expensive to ship.
But yeah, another great testament to the contemporary use of the book for these new purposes.
I know, I really want to see it when he started using it.
Did he give you imagery or motifs that he...
No, he said his name is Andy G, and he goes, I just want an Old English G. So I said, okay, I can do that. So I actually brought that here. It's here if people want to see it. So that was his only thing. And then I was kind of thinking of, the creeping vine sort of reminded me of different tattoo sort of designs I had seen. So I thought it would be kind of cool to try to refer to, in a very bookish way, tattoo design as well. But he mostly just cared about the G. That was all he wanted.
Let's talk about where you've been thinking your art practice will go as far as your other new projects. And can you talk how you want to begin with that, with your New Testament project, if you want to talk a little bit about that, or what you're envisioning taking all of this in your own very new expressive direction.
Sure. I've been mulling over the last few years just kind of the role books have played in history, even though they have this kind of sense of authority, and we almost take them at face value and tend to believe them from reading it because it's been printed and vetted and has some, it's a source of truth in some way. But of course, throughout the course of these books' history, they were a lot of times spreading harmful ideas and setting up systems that we're still dealing with today. And so I thought, wow, it's maybe not enough to just celebrate the beauty of these books. I think it'd be interesting to kind of explore maybe some of these other roles that they've played in establishing different ideas and that we're still dealing with. And so part of that is kind of, I hope to have some projects that are through the lens of my personal history. I was raised in a very kind of high control religious environment. And so I have some ideas of just to kind of explore the hypocrisy of some of those ideas. I'm certainly not anti-religious or anything, but but it's something that I think has been pretty cathartic for me to think about in a lot of ways too. And so I also think, ideas of wealth in the church in America are very confusing and kind of at odds with each other. And so I have some ideas to kind of explore that with some very ornate bindings of more humble texts. So I don't want to say too much yet because I really want to get started on it. But then sometimes there's celebrations of books that have had a really positive impact on my life. So another project is going to do the complete Calvin and Hobbes and cut a bunch of custom tools and things like that. And then I've also been really inspired to work more collaboratively. I think it's a really neat way to kind of include multiple voices in a single piece, and you always learn a lot by learning from other people's ways of working, and even if there are negotiations back and forth. Well, I don't mean to explain what collaboration is, but I've learned a lot from the process. Sorry.
Well, it's different. I mean, because you are start to finish, your process goes way out. Whereas for some, you can take a couple corners and cut those and get ahead a little bit. But yeah, I mean, you are very singular.
I think it's
with your work.
Maybe what I'm trying to express is it's been hard for me to relinquish complete creative control. I think it's like I'm used to controlling every step along the way. And so allowing someone else to do what they do well has, I didn't think that I had this problem, but I thought I was generally pretty chill about this kind of thing. About time. Okay. Well, no question.
Well, so on that front, with either collaboration or the projects that I know you had in mind, starting out with the McKnight, has anything shifted over this course of time for you with how you're going to approach those?
Yeah, I think it's given me time the biggest thing that I'm so grateful for is just having the time to really think and flesh out ideas. I feel like being mostly client commission based, I was always just kind of after the next commission or after the next workshop. And at one point too, I found myself, doing so much teaching that I wasn't getting any better at what I was doing. It was just kind of floating and teaching what I knew. And I thought, I just really need to have a chance to push it. And so the thing I'm the most grateful for, I think, is that it gave me some time and allowed me to have these conversations with other artists to come up with some really fun projects. So
that's great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I am now going to introduce Todd and Marcia a little more. So ever since Todd was a kid, he loved books and wanted to tell stories. Books were an escape from the tedium of small town life and a creative inspiration that struck him for life. For him, books opened up the world and exposed a wider canvas for him to explore. Todd studied commercial art and creative writing at the University of Minnesota and eventually started Angel Bomb to provide clients with graphic design and letterpress printing. With a focus on package design, he since has taken this skill and uses it to create books that encourage the reader to explore the object as well as what it means to them. His first two books were assisted in part through an MCBA Jerome Book Artist Fellowship grant and a Minnesota State Arts Board Artist Initiative grant. These paved the way for a change in focus from client work to book arts and have allowed Todd to refine his practice. He was master printer for Minnesota Center for Book Arts Winter Books in 2014 and 2016. Todd's work is in the collections of nearly 50 special collections, including Yale University, Wesleyan University, Savannah College of Art and Design, Bainbridge Island Museum of Art, and Duke University. Marcia Reed recently retired from the Getty Research Institute, where she was Chief Curator and Associate Director for Special Collections and Exhibitions. From the time of the GRI's establishment in 1983, she acquired many of its notable rare books, prints, and archives. Her research focuses on the history of illustrated books and prints, with special interest in avant-garde editions and contemporary artist books. As head of exhibitions, she oversaw the Research Institute's expanded program of exhibitions, its gallery expansion, and exhibition-related programs and publications. Among the many exhibitions she curated are Picturing the Natural World, China on Paper, European and Chinese Works from the 16th to early 19th centuries, The Edible Monument, The Art of Food for Festivals, and Cave Temples of Dunhuang, a Buddhist art on the Silk Road, and more. Her award-winning catalog of the GRI's Artist Book Collection, Artists and Their Books, Books and Their Artists, co-authored with Glenn Phillips, accompanied the summer 2018 exhibition. Her most recent catalog was published for the 2021 exhibition on Dada, Surrealist, and Fluxus works. Fluxus means change, Jean Brown's avant-garde archive. Her work is invested in ecological thinking and feminist perspectives. Okay, Todd, welcome to the podium to show your slides.
Full screen. Oop. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Welcome. I'd like to thank the McKnight Foundation and the Minnesota Center for Book Arts for this great honor. Oh, I should find the, there we go, okay. This Book Arts Fellowship has allowed me to focus on my art and finished 2 books this year, providing me with the financial support and affirmation that my work is relevant, timely, and appreciated. It has been a huge boon and motivation to my career. Thank you to Marcia for all your assistance and discussion over the past year. It has been inspiring and a delight to get to know you. My studio moniker is Angel Bomb. I started it as a design studio 27 years ago with the tagline of good design with impact. I added letterpress 18 years ago, and it predominantly worked for clients solving their visual problems. I did a lot of package design and included some art prints on the side. Unsatisfied with printmaking and desiring to tell deeper stories, I began book arts exploration and received the Jerome Book Arts Fellowship. Published my first book in 2012. Books were my escape from a bleak landscape of farm labor as a kid. They drove my creativity and passion for writing, drawing, particularly in horror and science fiction, mostly with H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe driving me. Creating my versions of the stories I loved as a kid gives me great joy and allows social analysis through fiction. By interpreting other authors' work through illustration and design, it has given me the confidence to expand my practice into more personal writing and work reflecting my life experience. The Airship, my first book, was a digitally enhanced graphic novel. It's about an autocratic ruler trying to use technology for war, a science fiction look into fascism, drive for power, and the misuse of technology. In it, you scan QR codes for short videos and exploration of the Zeppelin. It's an early work, and my illustration confidence was low. I chose a much simpler vintage style in which to illustrate it. I strive to facilitate deeper emotional connections to my books and promote curiosity by creating works that excite the reader's senses.
Through these interactions, my readers connect with the book as an embodiment of craft, an artistic object, and form more sustained memories through exploration. My books create ever-deepening layers of meaning, from the initial structure to the design and illustration choices, and seek to take the reader to bygone eras through material and visuals. I experiment with less traditional narrative structures and in pushing the boundaries of how I use type and image. The Beast in the Cave was a book I published last fall. It's an ode to Lovecraft's creative influence on me as a kid and early pulp stories. It was one of his earliest stories, written at age 14 and published when he was 15. Its predominant theme is the fear of the other and the violence inherent in mankind. It contains special materials like this dust jacket that's sewn in, which is made from a material when under heat and pressure, it turns the paper into like a watermark, which you can see when you hold it up to the light, as in it is on the right. It also has illustrations that are designed to create a sense of claustrophobia, and it develops as you go out throughout the book. There's a sewn-in bookmark with a flashlight to help you find your way. And on it, on the back, is a famous Lovecraft quote: "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." It's an introductory horror story for young people with playful and hidden elements throughout for the curious. Having traveled extensively, themes of exploration and fear of the unknown drive my work. I work in science fiction and horror genres predominantly, using existing manuscripts as well as writing original work to delve into societal fears of things such as contagion, loss of identity, and violence, which are so pertinent in today's society. I like creating ergodic books, that is, books that require more effort from the reader to interpret, rather than just as following a single narrative. In my free time, I paint models and make and paint models. And what draws me to this and the development of stories is world building, creating an object or an environment that through the exploration of the details tells more than just a story, but provides you with an emotional connection to the object. I began combining my modeling skills with my books and continue to do so, my first being the Miskatonic Papers. This is a very good example of an ergodic book in that it's told through the discovery of an archive. Excuse me, you search through an archive of fragments, letters, newspaper clippings, drawings, and a handwritten journal. There's a sense of realism, as actual seaweed was used, items were burned and aged and weathered. It contains an artifact that's central to the story. This was sculpted in a large format, broken into 6 pieces, then molded, cast in resin, and painted by hand. The story is an exploration of Siberian indigenous people, the Chukchi, and I created an ancient language based on a modified Glagolitic, which is the oldest known Slavic language. It's a fictionalization of the historic Tunguska event of 1908. Not all of my work is fiction, and I also create pieces analyzing the shortcomings or failures in our society. In 2020, watching the world burn and needless millions die from COVID, I felt the need to act. This is my book, 2020, A Fiasco. It's not funny. Memorializing the horrible year that we endured. I used my model making skills to create a book as an object, a dumpster as a binding, which represents America, tarnished and dirty from our policies. Inside it, the book is composed of 13 crises which were represented that we dealt with that year. The COVID pandemic, anti-vaxxers, white supremacists, climate crises, the murder of George Floyd, and fascist wannabe dictators. I was illustrating some of this garbage on January 6th when we were watching our Capitol under attack. And this is a brief process of how the dumpster was made. First, I'd make a paper maquette to determine the size, and then molded that or sculpted that with polystyrene. I determined how the lids would work, originally looking for a hinged utility, but that was just too complicated to cast. And then making a silicone mold, casting it in resin, and painting it in both acrylics and oils to make it look used and old. My most recent book was a passion project. Who Goes There was published in 1938 by John W. Campbell, and it's been the inspiration for so many books and stories and films throughout the years. It's one of my favorite stories, with the 1982 film version of The Thing being my favorite. It's about paranoia, humanity's distrust for others, and again, our violent nature. Interpreting and in illustrating these stories I love has given me the confidence to write my own and launch me into new avenues. I created a unique portfolio structure with a medallion embedded in the cover that's another cast resin artifact. It opens like an old expedition record book, as it was intended. It has a triptych map, which is hand altered, and a folder on the right-hand side hides 5 prints. Illustrating these horrors is really fun. I enjoy that so much. It's just a delight. And this has led me to my current book, which I will be printing this summer and binding this fall, which is The Things. It's a contemporary story, or it's written by a contemporary author, Peter Watts, a Canadian zoobiologist. And it's essentially the same story as Who Goes There, but told from the viewpoint of the alien, through a scientific lens, studying consciousness, intelligence, and what it means to be human. One of the things I struggled with this was how to show something from such a different aspect as an alien viewpoint. I tried several different illustration styles before settling on printing with a special UV ink. Here you can see it, the one on the right is glowing under UV light. I had to create this ink with the help from labs, basically trying to find something that would interact, be essentially blind or clear when printed, but then glow when presented with UV light. I've really extended my illustration styles because this is an alien piece, because this is viewed from the viewpoint of an alien. So when you're reading the book normally, you'll see black imagery like this, and then under light, it comes alive, and you see a lot more of what the story is about and what the alien is thinking. The illustrations come alive, illustrating the thoughts as the thing tries to understand violent humans. And I also created and designed and created a 3D printed saucer flashlight that you can use to look through your book. So where this leads me, right now I'm working on a project that I hope to have ready by our combined fellow show in this winter. It's based on my time in the Arctic, sailing around Svalbard on a tall ship. It's contrasting the beauty of a pristine polar environment with our environmental destruction and mass consumption of resources. The beauty is revealed under layers of one, human consumption. Another book I'm working on, and this is just a very basic picture, is Pathogenesis. It's looking at gun violence through the metaphor of disease. The inoculation, spread, and damage to the host. Our gun lust is a sickness in our society. It'll be another book as Object. The binding is a pathogen with AR-15 rounds that hide the story beneath. And lastly, I've used some of my McKnight funds to arrange for a tall ship sailing journey from Argentina to Antarctica this coming winter. I'm traveling there for research. I want to do a book on the Drake Passage, the legendary rough seas of one of the most rough waterways on the planet, sailing on a tall ship. And I see that being a very tactile book, something with knots and wood and has a very old time feel. And I also plan on doing a piece about glaciers and then writing my own story set in Antarctica. Thank you very much.
Are we good?
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
First, just to say thank you so much. It's been so much fun to work with Todd, to work with Annika, to work with Elisa, to come to Minneapolis. I was involved in another jurying, and it was in 2020, so I never got to come back to the MCBA. So it's pretty exciting to be able to actually be here with the artists. And I have to say, talking with you has been one of the highlights of this past year. Retirement, for those of you who haven't done it yet, is highly recommended because you get to do what you want to do. And it's been really fun to refocus on books and art, which are my real passions. And so this has been a sort of wonderful time to spend working with Todd and his interesting books. And I have to, yes, he's in the audience. I have to also thank my husband, Mike Morrison, because I didn't know anything about H.P. Lovecraft, and luckily he did. He's a very complex writer, and so I kind of put that together as I was working on Todd's complex writing and art as well. You have very intriguing projects. So your books, you've probably been able to see as Todd showed the books that they're very different. He doesn't do the same book over and over again, and yet the good thing is they look like your books. They have very distinctive paths. Part of them are concerned with social, political issues, environmental, social justice concerns. And then there's lurking, creepy horror monsters, which she seems to, you must have monster blood. Yes. So there are the books. The impressive thing is you started with writing your own texts and doing your image, as you say, in kind of a graphic, your own graphic novel format on social concerns and political critiques. But then there is the other track of the books which illustrate and interpret, bring to life authors such as H.P. Lovecraft, more recently Peter Watts, whom you did kind of collaborate with since he's still alive. Mm-hmm. And these books, like The Beast in the Cave or The Things, are kind of extreme science fiction, horror visualized. So going from the text and then really making it more experiential and visual. So you're interpreting the author's words in your own design and art elaborations. And then the readers go to them and are fueled further to create their own experience and interpretation of these things. So the question is, when you start out, do you see these projects clearly as books, or do you just start out with an idea, sort of like those you've shown, a subject that interests you, and you use this word ergodic, which sent me running to Google to look that up. But it's a good word because it sort of shows going in different directions, but then bringing together. So talk sort of about how you conceptualize your works.
Sure. I think a lot of it really comes back to my early package design roots. I always wanted to create something that was engaging, that would surprise people. If you're opening just a box, even just having something printed on the inside, just the unexpected, I delight in that. And I always strove to get people to want to keep that. As designers or as book people, as creatives, like we love to, like, oh, this is just a beautiful little print or an image, and save these things. I always wanted to try and promote that, the holding on of something versus just it's tossing into the garbage.
Except when your art is garbage.
Except when the art is garbage. just laid it on fire. I really do start with an idea. Like, I mean, I've had a surprising number of ideas in the shower because you're just relaxed, and it's like you're not worrying or thinking about anything else. You're not looking at your phone, and usually they just come from some kernel. You know, like for instance, with even just trying to think about like what my next work would be. Like, I started thinking about, you know, what is the story, or what like the thing, and who goes there. I've been a fan of that for decades, and so it took me like 3 years to find who had the copyright holder, but you know, just pushed along and found it, and kind of stumbled along, and then you know, reached out to the rights holder and signed a contract. But they really do start, I guess, just as like a kernel, and then I start playing with, well, how can I envision that? I strive to do things that are different than other people, and also, but not different for the sake of being different, but different in ways that correlate to the narrative.
Yeah, yeah. It is nice that you work in so many different directions, though. The other thing that I liked a lot about your books were the special effects, because special effects are kind of a big deal these days. People in California even have license plates that say things like SPFX and things like that, because they work in special effects. And you go, which is nice, you go from this sort of 2D folded page or maybe a sheet to an object, an enclosure, a material feature that is like finding something in the box, unwrapping things and finding something else that you can pick up. It's not the same as turning pages and things like that, but that you have. And it's really a sort of added value. But again, they're all different. And that's, you know, that's kind of a fun thing that you do with your books as well. So talk about, I think what it relates to is this nice phrase, exploration or explosion.
Okay.
Which sounds good until it's not good anymore. And so what you're doing is kind of offering, in a way, the reader a shot, him or herself, at discovering something, finding something, and then finding its value for them in a way.
I think what leads me to seek that out or to pursue that, I mean, Brien mentioned something about nostalgia, and a lot of these stories are, as I feel my career growing, like I'm looking back and drawing upon sort of early formative memories. And Emily had mentioned yesterday that some of my work seemed cinematic almost, and which I found really intriguing because films are just a huge impetus for me, and I'm so inspired by them. Oftentimes I kind of view things visually in a cinematic, you know, almost like a storyline kind of way. And I think it also had to do with like some of the early films that I saw, like The Goonies or Indiana Jones, where there's I always longed to have an experience where I went to an attic or a basement, and I love the creepy ones. But finding something really like valuable or unique or old and hidden, and I go to my grandparents' attic or basement and just find old clothes or dolls, very mundane and boring things. But there was always this imagination of like, what's going to be inside here. That's something that is just I'm drawn to. It's that delight, the discovery. I think I've always been a curious person, and I'll fall down a rabbit hole looking up something or other. So just really trying to kind of put that out there and evoke or elicit emotional connections from the reader, something where they have that moment of delight or surprise, and hopefully it reminds them of something in their past, or that they make a deeper connection than just reading words.
Yeah, I think that's a nice thing. Some people, some dry professors who give boring lectures only do research in books and maybe on the internet. But then there's another way to do research, and that's to go out there and really, experience and find things. And you, I think, particularly like the idea of finding, the arcana, if you're ever lucky enough to get there, but also archives and secret knowledge that you find maybe just lying unnoticed somewhere, and then you're looking and you put some things together and realize, oh, wait a minute, I got it. Or as in, there's a gutter page, and it's the thing that says help. Is it in the
Oh,
Beast?
in the
Is it
Beast in the Cave.
Cave?
Yep.
Yeah, it's really wonderful because you get to this page and then it just says help. It's great. But you are really interested in these kind of secret histories, and just finding them. So I think discovery, either on land or sea, or in the library and the archive, is really important too.
It is. I think again, like with my curiosity and just wanting to be a lifelong learner, finding things like, yes, the discover. I think discovery is not only the hey, look, this is thousands of years old. This is something that's been hidden away from society, from humankind for ages. There's that sort of monumental discovery, but there's also just the discovery of taking a walk in your neighborhood and noticing like the flower on a plant that you hadn't noticed before, or something like that, and just taking that delight. But I think especially in this day of digital communication, so much of what we get is kind of aggregated and fed to us, versus us going out, like, going to a library. Like the difference between going to a library and a library or a bookstore, versus like being online, is like you're actually going through and you're pulling them out like, oh my gosh, I'd never heard of this person. There's even just that everyday discovery, which I think is so much more emotionally strengthening. Like you're going to have a stronger memory than finding a book online that you did the search parameters and it just showed you what you wanted to see, versus stumbling upon it and then having this serendipity and joy of like, oh my gosh, this is something completely new.
I think it also builds a contextual memory, and context for things is very different, and that's what you really don't get searching online and things like that. There's no good context for it, and it makes a difference. Speaking of context, so I had been looking at pictures of Todd's studio online, and it's a really great studio. It's red, and it has an impressive array of presses lined up, and they're big machines. They have a certain presence. They weigh a lot. You have to take care of them, give them time and space. And I hadn't really put that together about you until I, really looked. I was in the studio. So I think you're also strongly drawn to the materials, the equipment of press work and printing and taking care of it. Then I saw his car, and that that started to put things together. And my father was a car collector, so I just thought, oh, his studio is like my dad's garage. But why don't you talk about you're obviously drawn to those amazing, and also in some cases vintage machines.
So most of my presses, I've got 3 Heidelbergs and a Vandercook. The Heidelbergs date from the mid-1950s, and I think the Vandercook is from the 40s. I grew up on the farm, and I was sort of forced into this wrenching perspective and having to work, and always, like, as a kid and coming home just filthy and greasy. I did not enjoy that at all. But once I got my first press, it was like, oh, okay, I can take care of that. So I do have this interest in sort of maintaining these machines. But they do have a very a beautiful aesthetic. Like I find my work has been called retrofuturistic. I find that my, kind of even my studio, like my illustration styles have long been sort of mid-century in era, and they fit amazing into that, and they're engineering marvels. To think that these are all composed of, I mean, they're very complex, but they're all composed of simple machines, like the little wheels. You combine them, and combine 50 of these together in complex ways, you have a printing press. So there's something about that, the sheer intelligence that went into making those from predating computers. This would have been slide rules, drawing, calculators. I find that really amazing, and sort of then coaxing them to make the work my art. There's something, they're my partner.
They have pet status.
They do, yes. It's like, good boy. And so there is something, and they're all different. They have quirks, like they feed differently, etc. You get to understand it, just like your pets or your friends. They all have their own.
And there's this meditative part that you talked about of maintaining them or feeding things or doing the production that I want you to talk about.
Yeah. With my background in production, achieving consistency and as close as you can get to perfection is what people were trying to get. And so there's definitely a craft in how you're running the press, everything from how it's feeding, which can affect how it's registering, to the amount of ink. All these things you're balancing, and it is a kind of a meditative process. Like, I've made as many as like 15,000 chocolate wrappers, for instance. And I love that aspect of it. But really, what I'm trying to sort of push myself or get away from is doing more, like the production end of things is. I love that, but also in the creativity, what I hope to gain is some more spontaneity, or like the happy accidents, working more with my hands, and then just utilizing the press to sort of reproduce that. But I do love. I've always loved looking at different papers, different substrates. What can I do that is a unique way of getting this message across that is new or unusual?
So we talked a little bit. I've been trying to interest Todd and the idea of maybe doing a children's book, and he said, "Yeah, actually, I've kind of thought about this." And he does have this nice wry lightness when you're even when you're dealing with very serious, problematic issues, and it seems like that's suitable to children's books. When you were very young, what were your favorite books as a child, and who gave you books, or how did you get them? Did you go to a library and pick them out yourself? And then you could talk a little bit about thinking about making a children's book.
Okay. I don't have as many specific memories of specific books. I do remember a dinosaur book, and even had a voice recording of me trying to read from it when I was about 6 on like my dad had recorded it on a reel-to-reel, and here I'm trying to, please see this on the timeline. Like, it's just a bad book to try and read, let alone for a 6-year-old. But I remember the Century School book in the first book that I was learning to read. And I actually have a bunch of old Century School book type that I'd like to use in a project or two. Other than that, like I really loved, again, the going to the library. The library, I remember when I was in like 1st and 2nd grade, they had big cast iron, like the enameled bathtubs with like sort of vinyl couch cushions in there, and you could sink in there with a book and be below the level, like you were in your own little world.
Where was this?
This would have been in Bismarck, North Dakota.
Oh, okay. Architectural decorations.
And then, older ones, we moved to a small town. I remember the bookmobile, the county bookmobile coming, which was just some funky old van just filled with books. I can't imagine how that handled on the road. And then it just had the old book smell. And I just consumed. And I remember like Zeppelins. I mean, my first book features a Zeppelin. I checked a book out about Zeppelins, like my name was on the card more than anybody else. It was probably like, at least half or 3/4 of the slots were all checked out to me.
The blimp interest group.
The blimp interest group. And I don't want to talk about it too much, but I do have an idea for a children's book. I appreciate that you mentioned that even though I'm dealing with sometimes difficult topics, there is a brevity or a wryness to it, because I do find humor in a lot of, like, that's how, I mean, my wife and my relationship is sort of built on mockery and humor. So it's part of who I am. So yeah,
the garbage container, which you told us all to stop laughing about.
It's not funny.
It's a nice thing, because especially with children's books, you can't just hammer away and make them know that life is going to be really terrible,
Right.
We're sort of in our last minutes. Do you want to talk about why books are important? This is one of my real sort of, the meaning of life to me is why books are so important, and they're not going to go away. And I'm so happy to go through airports and see people, reading their books and holding on to books.
I feel like it's so easy to sort of devolve or just slide into, because again, it's so easy to just looking at our phones or consuming digitally. And there's just something about I feel this connection, like the brain-body connection of seeing the words and putting them together and structuring them, and then kind of combining that into a vision inside your head. For me, like we built our house when I was 9. So I remember like we'd go down in the middle of winter, because my dad had a summer job, or a job that he couldn't do in the summer. So we were building this house in winter. I was 9 years old. We'd go down into the into the coal bin, which was the only place that was like warm enough to like heat soup over an open flame and have lunch. In the summer, like we didn't have any trees; it was just hot and sunny, and so like anytime I could, like I would love to sit in the shade and read, or sit inside and read. But I remember like reading books, climbing trees and reading books, or sitting by the river and reading books. They really did give me an escape. And in a small town, I mean, so often you hear of small towns being, I don't know, lauded. But in my experience, there was no culture, there was no interest in art, there was no, like, my creativity really wasn't supported by most of my family. And so it really was just how I kind of felt like I discovered the world, and that there was so much more. And Lovecraft's writings gave me this love of New England, even though I hadn't, didn't get there until I was in the Navy. But it exposes you to things that books expose you to things, ideas, places that you just never would get otherwise.
Certainly in time as well as place. So, yeah.
Okay, we're gonna have Emily and Brien back up, and I think Marcia might have had a question for Brien, or and Emily vice versa. And there might have just been a little bit of reflection of the studio visits from this week. And for audience members, you can take a moment to think about what questions you might have for the group.
Do you want to talk some more about your cinematic comments? Emily had some very interesting sort of comments to Todd about how you pick this up, because you say it better than I do.
Sure. Yeah, I was really immediately lured in by that aspect of immersion that is a part of your work and experience. And it was so funny in the moment, because I was thinking, I didn't want to have a reference point that maybe would offend you. So I didn't want to say Indiana Jones and Goonies, and then immediately you said that, and it was like you brought these stories to life in a way that as kids we wanted. It is experiential and immersive to watch a movie or read a book, but you're doing it in this so much deeper way of making it this personal production design experience for the person who gets to open these up. So yeah, if you could talk even the multisensory side of some of your projects, if you want to.
Thank you. No, I think that was a great observation, and I really do get a lot of inspiration from films, and even wanted to work in film as a young person, but not knowing anything other than like, oh, acting. And I was like, I'm not that. But I think again, like, yes, I do love to involve as many senses as you can. I even tried in the Miskatonic Papers, or I even considered like including olfactory senses. I worked with a candle maker to try and develop an old book smell. And so we had a couple of options, and they were okay. But then I was really starting to think of like, well, what's the dosage per book? How long is that going to last? Is it going to be noticeable, or is it going to be offensive? Like, whoa. So I ended up just leaving that. But it's like, I don't know, definitely I'm trying to push the boundaries. There's lots of hidden things in my book. So I'm trying to encourage exploration and that discovery.
How does explosion work? You say exploration or explosion.
Oh,
what's the explosion
I thought
part?
you wrote that.
No,
I didn't put those two together.
I'll send you
Well, if maybe related to that, do you feel cathartic in these when you complete these projects, especially these political?
Absolutely, and especially like I think that's one of the reasons why I really love the the genre work is it gives me an emotional kind of distance from it. Like I said, when I was illustrating the garbage for 2020, and then happened to watch, have the news on and watching our capital under attack, is just brutal and infuriating. And so being able to kind of step back and have this cushion of creepy monsters between me and like the theme, it's much easier for me to tolerate being like an empath or an empathetic person that listens to somebody argue and then they feel all terrible even though they're not part of the argument. It's something that it gives me distance, and then it's also like I feel like in someone who writes themselves, like being able to subtly or incorporate bigger themes into it without hitting someone over the head, I think is a very fine line to walk.
Well, for both of you, it's very constructive, essentially. So to have all these ideas and then put it into a final object, I think, can be totally a way to get it outside of yourself.
Makes you feel like you can do something.
Yeah. How much? Well, for each of you, do you keep in touch with who has your work, and do you ever get any good stories about how they're being put to use?
I did get a story, or I met someone, I think met them at Codex. They were like a professor, and they were using like my Miskatonic papers. They were showing that as being a good system of archiving. And yeah, like I had gone to the Minnesota Historical Society and talked to them about archiving and looked at samples and just did some research, but like by no means did I think that like, oh, I'm an archivist. But they found how I was labeling it, like to be really clear or something, and I was impressed with that. I am keeping a list of collectors. And occasionally I'll hear from someone. It's really delightful to get like a handwritten note, like, oh, I love this, it's just amazing. So I keep all of those.
Burned and with seaweed on it.
Yeah.
I would say the one that pops out immediately was I was asked to do a binding for another bookbinder, and she's also happens to be like my favorite bookbinder. If I had to pick a favorite, and so she uses it as a log for all of her projects that she does, and so it's this really special. I went to visit her this spring, and I was able to see it again and see how it was wearing and how it was being used. And I was like, wow, it's like turning into, it's like doing all the same things I see that old books do. Not falling apart, but I mean, just the way it's going. But just kind of the way it was wearing and getting used to itself and kind of relaxing that was really special. I hear a lot more from other binders with the tools, just because I see them more often. And it's always really special when someone sends me a picture of a book that they use the tools on. And I'm always like, yes.
And some of the people who purchase your tools, don't they kind of display them and, of course use them, but like what's the split of, because they're beautiful objects, the tools.
I think it kind of just depends on the person. I mean, sometimes I'll go and visit someone who has a few things and they're just like in a pile in a coffee can, and I'm like, that's great too. But sometimes, for instance, that one project that I highlighted, I sent the tools with the project too, so the client has the tools as well as the book as well. I made like a little box.
What will she do with them?
I have no idea.
Right.
But I just felt like they were more hers,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so yeah, and she also said that she's like, I'm not sure what I'll do with them, but I really, really like them.
Yeah.
I said, all right, that works for me.
Are there any questions from the audience? I can come around with the mic for any questions.
Thank you for your inspiring sharing of your work. I have a question for Brien. Once you've made a tool, are there other purposes to which these could be put? Could you emboss paper with them? Could you make type out of them? Could you make jewelry with them?
Great question. I have also made them a lot for woodworkers. I handle them a little differently because, of course, if you're going to be doing wood branding, you have to heat it up to the burning point of wood. And so I don't want the handles to get charred, but a lot of times woodworkers will ask for them to, like, I know a lot of spoon carvers and people who make smaller housewares, and so they use them for like their maker's mark. And I have been asked to engrave some bigger brass plates to do like a whole book cover for a conservator out in Massachusetts. Though I haven't started that one yet. But I also thought about trying to make different ones, just kind of as like wearable jewelry or something, because I know a lot of book people like have bone folder necklaces and earrings and stuff. Hey, we're not finishing tools. But I also have worked with Mara a bit on using them on shoes as well.
There's one question here, and then I'll go back.
So to Todd Thyberg's comment about open mockery in our marriage, I was going to ask him, so how do you get those big printers up to the second floor of the Northern King building? Because I know that's one of your favorite questions, but I'm not going to ask that. Instead, I just feel like there's a really good positive energy exchange around the panel. And what I'm curious to hear is, how do you inspire each other? So between you and Todd, whoever would like to go first.
We're going to talk about this at home. It's been amazing seeing Brien's work and getting to know him like I did. We didn't know each other before this. And we've been talking about wanting to do a collaboration together. I have a weird relationship with religion as well from my upbringing. And so hopefully we'll do something with that. But as Marcia pointed out, like I do love my tools. And here's a guy that's making them. It's just, I don't know, it's amazing. Like we have our own rabbit holes that we've fallen down, and they're very different, but they're also just like very, very cool. And I'm like, yeah, I'm thrilled by that.
Yeah, I think to summarize that, I definitely feel a sort of kindred spirit in that I too would go into grandparents' attics and look for the box of like the weird treasure that lightens up your face when you open it, and then instead also found just not that. And but I think I really am inspired by how when Todd gets into a project, it's like all in. And I mean, it's like all of those tiny little details. I mean, to the point where you were telling us about how much you had to think about, burning the edges of 250 copies of something and figuring out how to do that in a systematic way that, kept your fingers safe and then also didn't char everything but was consistent, and I just think that amount of thought that you put into the projects is really inspiring. And I think I can really relate to that in my own way, though of course our expression of these things is like couldn't be more different in a lot of ways, which is really cool too.
For curators, it's really important. I'm not an artist, and so it's very, very important to understand not only the work itself, but what the artist is trying to do as much as it's possible to do that. Because when you're writing about it or when you're planning an exhibit, you need to have that be part of the thought process, and be informed by it. It's interesting that the works do go out there, and many times you're not able to speak with the artist, but when you can, it's so helpful to understand the process, even though the process is very different. I'm sure you have
Yeah,
comments.
I mean, I completely agree, and I think for what both of you do, and even for this field, I think it's hard to convey sometimes in 2 dimensions and digitally back to that this is so tactile. You have to experience it to really get it. So yeah, I mean, it's invaluable to see your work in person and to hear really what each of you, of course you can convey where you're coming from, but the work itself is just, we all know, I think we're probably preaching to the choir here, that you have to experience it in the flesh. Yeah. Do you have a question?
Oh, yeah. Hi, for Brian, I'm curious, you mentioned the possibility of maybe trying to move towards bronze, that bronze casting process, rather than, I believe you said it's brass that you're currently using. I'm curious if there's a appreciable lifespan or degradation to your current process where you get a certain amount of uses or something like that before you have to start over again.
Right. No, that's a great question. I think, in short, I would say no, but from talking with tons of different binders from different parts of the world, for whatever reason, there is this idea that bronze is the best material. And from my own experience and from talking with physicists and metallurgists, that the actual heating properties of the two alloys that between the two that I'll be playing with, it's like maybe bronze is 10% better at holding heat, so you get 11 impressions instead of 10 before you have to reheat. So at the scale most binders are working at, it's not a huge difference. Bronze wears a little bit better as you have to polish the face before you make a new impression, and so that is abrasive, and eventually, your designs get worn away. But I mean, I'm talking over the course of like tens of thousands of impressions that you can make. And so, but I also appreciate that with bronze, when you're casting, there's a lot less waste. And with something working with these solid big pieces and cutting pieces away, you just end up with a lot more little scraps, and you can turn the offcuts into more tools, so it's not super wasteful. But with bronze, I mean, you can just take what you cast that you don't need and throw it back in the pot, and then make more tools with it. So that also really appeals to me as well. Thank you.
We have a question.
Thank you for a really meaningful panel, for all involved. I think the one thing that wasn't really discussed that I'd love to hear both of you talk about is paper. What kind of papers do you respond to and why? And some of your concerns about that. Thank you.
I come from, again, like coming from like the production background. A lot of my papers are a little bit more, not quite the commodity level, but it's more production level paper. I do work with cotton sheets a lot, but I haven't worked with as much like really fine press papers. And I have planned, I'd like to, most of my projects have been sort of really big, and I'd like to get a few more smaller projects in there, maybe with just a smaller run, almost more, I don't know, just find like little monographs. And I look forward to exploring with more paper, more different kinds of paper with that. I do have a couple of projects, well, the Arctic one, and then another one that I'm working on about scars, where I'm working with translucency. The Arctic, I decided to go with a drafting paper, which is actually like a drafting film. So that's more plastic, and that also has to do with the nature of the story. Being in Arctic, we picked up like half a ton of garbage, most of that being plastic. So that kind of lends to that versus, say, a very thin, like Japanese paper, which I think might be more appropriate for the scars project that I'm working on. But I don't, so I've had a lot of experimentation, but again, it's mostly been with production stuff. And as I start to work in smaller kind of doses, I look forward to trying some new stuff.
Thank you for that question. I like that. Because of course, with the type of binding that I do, those bindings kind of evolved with the type of paper that was available. And so a lot of times that in older books, the paper is really thin, really strong, has really nice drape. And so even though the spine itself isn't very flexible, the paper can do that work for you. And that's a huge challenge when trying to work in this historic binding style. A lot of people will give me a modern text to do sort of retrofit it. And I mean, structurally, they don't want to work together. It's kind of like when people do stab bindings with really heavy duty modern Western papers and they won't open. So I'm actually working on a collaboration right now with a letterpress printer. And as part of that, we're working with a paper maker, Andrea Peterson in Northwest Indiana. And so she's actually going to be making us some super thin book paper for that printing as well. So that it'll all actually work kind of harmoniously together structurally. And then also, of course, we have Mary Hark here in the Twin Cities, and so I absolutely love incorporating her paper into my bindings. I primarily use it right now as cover paper, but I have some ideas that I've been thinking upon that I will be in touch about.
Okay, I think we'll do one last question, and then if there's any remaining questions, we'll have some time for everyone to talk and have some cookies.
Well, thanks, Annika. My question is for Brien. By the way, props on your vintage PBI shirt. That's awesome.
Thank you. It's in mint condition.
Pardon me?
I said it's in mint condition.
Yeah, I know. It's just incredible.
My cleanest t-shirt.
Yeah. I was wondering if you made it. I'm curious about the timeline of the arc of your career, and in particular, when it was that you hit your knees and begged to be taught bookbinding by that curator, and also when you had the opportunity, or were given the opportunity to set up your own a conservation lab. When did that happen?
It was way too short of a window, which is why I felt so underqualified. I started binding the fall of my sophomore year of college, and then it was 2 years later that I was graduating, and then this library approached me, and I told them, like, no, I'm so not qualified for this, but I think they really liked my enthusiasm, but then I think they also knew that I would perhaps be a cheaper hire than other
possibly.
individuals.
And not to get personal, but the stream of my question relies on knowing the period of time that was. So was that 20 years ago, 15 years ago?
So I bound my first book in 2009.
2009.
And I started that job in the fall of 2012.
Oh, okay. I'm pretty jealous that you were offered that conservation position, particularly since it's my impression that those kinds of jobs do not come along for people who aren't formally trained. Every job that I've ever taken I've been excited about because it's an opportunity to learn as I go. And I've been fortunate enough to be given the opportunity by the people who've hired me to do that, entrusted me with that. And about 5 years ago, I asked somebody, having become really interested in conservation, if there was such an opportunity for somebody to learn on the job. And they knew my background and didn't have any formal training in conservation. And so when they stopped laughing, they explained how incredibly, with the rise of the interest in conservation and the rise of formal programs, they explained that even apprenticeships, non-paying apprenticeships, were highly coveted and competitive. So I'm wondering how that situation occurred, because I thought, well, maybe that was 25 years ago before all this, but 2009.
the way that it happened was that as I was about to graduate, there was a guy who had come up to Special Collections and was interested in bookbinding. And so I would kind of help him out with different things, troubleshooting different aspects of making his book. And he was a retired lawyer. And so we kind of became friends just from doing that. And then when I was about to graduate, he said, "Hey, I'd love to go to lunch with you. I have this idea." So I said, "Okay." So we go to lunch, and he said, "I think there's a market for doing leather bindings of classic literature, and I think it would be really fun if, maybe we could try to set something up together, and I could kind of bankroll to get things started." I thought, "Oh my God, this doesn't exist."
A patron.
And so we went to meet with, he said, "I even think we have a space we can do it." So we went to the Library Society, which is where I ended up working. Of course, Charleston just so happened that his wife was the executive director, and they had this space set aside to turn into a conservation lab. And basically she said, "Will, that idea is never going to work, but maybe we could just hire Brien instead." And again, I was really petrified, and I knew enough to know how much I didn't know, and I was really, really careful to try to establish a network of established conservation professionals who could help inform what I was doing, so that it wasn't like I was just destroying all these books that were coming across the bench.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And thanks again so much to Marcia and Emily for coming to Minneapolis. Brien and Todd have very kindly brought some samples of their work, so please feel free to look at those and talk to the two of them about that. We have some cookies and drinks out in the Literary Commons, so please help yourself, and feel free to come up if you have any of your own questions. And just as a reminder to everyone, not really a reminder, an announcement, in January 2025 is when Brien and Todd will be showing with the 2022 McKnight Fellows in the main gallery. So please, this winter, look out for that and come to their exhibition. Thank you so much. People can
touch stuff.
Don't touch it after you've eaten a cookie, though. Clean hands. Okay, thank you, everyone.